new results of studies of ionizing radiation effects in humans, epidemiologic methodology, and dosimetry. Support capacity building and training for the next generation of epidemiologists, statisticians, and dosimetrists, and promote and facilitate international collaborations. So you can head to our website, which is isored.org, and I'll put that in the chat as well, to find out more information and how to become a member or get involved with one of our working groups. And if you are interested in becoming a future presenter at one of these webinars, please do not hesitate to reach out. I'll leave my email in the chat. I would like to note that this presentation will be recorded. During the presentation, please make sure to mute your microphone. For questions, please use the raise hand function or write your questions in the chat. So we will take questions at the end of the presentation. So today I am pleased to be joined by my Canadian colleagues from Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada, to present their work on risks of cardiovascular and dementia mortality and cataract morbidity associated with occupational exposure to ionizing radiation in the nuclear power plant cohort from the Canadian National Dose Registry, which contains occupational radiation exposure data for nearly 1 million workers. I'd like to introduce Dr. Paul Villeneuve, who is a professor with the School of Mathematics and Statistics and the Department of Neuroscience at Carleton University. He is joined by Dr. Laura Rodriguez Villamizar, who is currently completing a postdoctoral fellowship in environmental and occupational epidemiology, and Brianna Frangioni, who is a PhD candidate in epidemiology. And I'll now turn the floor over to them.
Okay, thank you, Christy, and thanks to the organizers for inviting us to give an update on our research program. And just by way of background, our work and our program on this would have started in about 2019, just before the pandemic, where we were approached by the Can-Do Owners Group here in Canada to start to lay out a plan to look at the impacts of low-dose ionizing radiation on cardiovascular disease, life expectancy, and non-cancer outcomes. And we're excited now because we're finally at the stage where we've been able to get record linkage done. We have some very preliminary results. And I think it's a great time for us to be working on this cohort because there's going to be a lot of opportunities coming up down the road. But at any rate, of course, there were some delays with the pandemic and prioritizations given over looking at sort of COVID type outcomes. So there's been some delays, but we're now at the stage where we're getting into data analysis. So in addition to Laura and Brianna, who've played vital roles in the project the last little bit, I also want to acknowledge collaborators that have worked with us on some of our Ontario analysis, but more in depth in some of the national studies of this cohort. And Rachel Lane, who's with Christy at CNSC, has played a vital role in terms of arranging for the linkage of the National Dose Registry to national cancer incidence and mortality. Lydia Zablotska, who many of you are familiar with, who's been working with the National Dose Registry for many decades now. So she's been helpful as well to us. And then, of course, Doug Chambers, who's given us some expertise on dosimetry, and staff at Health Canada who are ultimately responsible for maintaining the National Dose Registry. I also want to acknowledge our funders, the Can-Do Owners Group, who supported a lot of the work, especially with the Ontario studies. And we're also very excited to have received funding from the Canadian Institutes of Health Information last year for continued funding of analysis of the National Dose Registry for the next 4 years. So with that, I want to provide you a little bit of a background in terms of what our focus has been on the last little bit and some of the directions that we're interested in going on. So we're making use of the Canadian National Dose Registry, one of the largest occupational cohorts of exposed workers in the world. And there's really two key components to this. One of them involves workers who live in Ontario or worked in Ontario and are captured in the National Dose Registry. And the advantage of that is in Ontario, there's mechanisms where we can link occupational data to outcomes from physician billings, from hospitalization, so we can look at incident type of outcomes. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about our findings for cataracts and glaucoma outcomes in relation to exposure to radiation. And then we also have some planned studies that are sort of at the initial stages of looking at cardiovascular, dementia, and Parkinson's. And Brianne in particular will be talking more about the dementia because that forms a part of her PhD thesis. So in addition to that, some of our non-cancer studies in the nuclear power plant workers also plan to look at cardiovascular mortality. And Laura will be speaking about that. And then another outcome that we can get from the mortality linkage is dementia. So, part of the background for this is, many studies of occupational exposure to ionizing radiation have tended to focus in on cancer outcomes, cancer incidents. And I think the findings with the atomic bomb survivors cohort showing, some clear dose response relationships with cardiovascular endpoints, as well as some other findings of radiation exposed patients developing increased risk of cardiovascular disease, speak to a need to sort of better understand some of these exposure response functions, especially at levels that workers are currently exposed to. And there's a number of these outcomes that warrant attention. So these include the ocular diseases, the dementias, that have been the focus of some of our preliminary work. And the nice thing about the occupational data is with cohorts like the National Dose Registry, we have information on doses over prolonged working periods. There are mechanisms in place where we can follow these workers, and then we can look at issues related to latency of exposure response curves, and so on. So a bit of background in terms of the nuclear power plant scene in Canada is there's basically 5 nuclear power plants in operations. 3 of them are here in Ontario, and you'll see that they're listed here. And they've basically been in operation from the mid-1970s onwards. There's also another power plant that's in Quebec and another one in La Pro. So there are workers, of course, in all of these plants, and they sort of form the basis of our analysis here. We have a separate study going on now that's looking at mortality patterns and cancer incidence among residents that live near these power plants. But for today, I'm going to be focusing in on our analysis with the National Dose Registry and the workers who have been employed at these plants. So in terms of our overall objective of the research program involving the nuclear power plant workers, we're really focused in on looking at cardiovascular mortality and dementia mortality. And we're able to look at this through the record linkage that was done at Statistics Canada to national cancer incidence and mortality. But of course, we're just focusing in on the mortality outcomes. And again, I'm going to report today some of the findings that we've been getting for looking at cataracts and glaucoma. And then I think a really nice feature of our research program is we're able to use the Ontario data to look at incident outcomes of cardiovascular disease, dementia, And we've put in proposals to look at Parkinson's disease as well down the road, because there's increasing evidence that there may be links with that outcome as well. So for those of you who aren't that familiar with the Canadian National Dose Registry, this is a database that's basically been maintained by Health Canada, and it's been in operation since the 1950s or even late 1940s. There's approximately 1 million workers who are in this database. Some of these have been retired. It's a dynamic cohort with workers coming and going at all times. We have quarterly estimates of doses for these workers. Different types of radiations are captured, from gamma to beta. We have whole body doses. We're starting to sort of help develop estimates of internal dose estimates for some of our analysis as well. And about 5 years ago, maybe longer, and I'm sure Rachel Lynn could give you more of a background. There was an initiative sort of put forward to try to update the record linkage of this cohort, because the last time it had been updated was more than 20 years ago. So this has been really helpful, of course, with the interest in looking at effects of low dose radiation. Having the more recent data, the longer follow-up, becomes very important. And it's also, I think, important to recognize that Health Canada has played a key role in this and provided some funding for the record linkage as well. So our analysis are really going to be based on the 100,000 nuclear power plant workers. And I'll get into sort of how we selected that cohort and some of our initial findings for cataracts and glaucoma. But just to give you a bit of a breakdown, because the National Dose Registry isn't just nuclear power plant workers. There's a majority of the National Dose Registry is actually medical workers. There's about 16% nuclear energy workers. One of the nice things I think about this cohort is that there's a fair number of women that are captured in this database. So I know some, including Christy and Lydia, have written about some of the sex differences in terms of risk estimates. So the National Dose Registry provides a really nice opportunity to look at some of those things. You'll also see here on the slide some depiction of changes in radiation doses over the years. So you'll see that the doses are relatively low, certainly compared to historical doses. But again, with the size of the cohort and the variation in exposure across the different types, I think it provides a rich opportunity for investigating health effects of low-dose radiation. So I'm going to talk about these different projects now. And again, I've mentioned the two different types, the Ontario and the national. And again, just to bear in mind, the national linkage is what we've really focused in on for looking at mortality outcomes. The other thing that I think it's really important to recognize is that over the last couple of years, as we've waited for some of the record linkages to be worked through, one of the things that we've embarked on is conducting some systematic reviews of non-cancer outcomes. And Lydia Zablotska and I worked with Tanvi down at the University of California, San Francisco, who led a systematic review on dementia outcomes. And Laura and Brianna have also been involved in systematic reviews of cardiovascular disease. And of course, they're both now doing analysis of both dementia and cardiovascular outcomes. So I'm going to talk about some of the first results that we've found. And this is related to the work where we've linked data from the National Dose Registry to Ontario data looking at glaucomas and cataracts. So just to give you a bit of a background, our overarching objective was to look at these two outcomes in the Ontario nuclear power plant workers. And we really undertook two different types of comparisons. The first one was we wanted to compare whether rates of cataracts and glaucoma were higher in these workers than compared to the Ontario population. So this is the external cohort comparison. And then we further did analysis within the cohort where we compared rates of glaucoma and cataracts across different categorical levels of cumulative exposure. Now, we presented some of these findings at a conference in Montreal last summer, and we've currently drafted out a manuscript, and this is under publication review. So for those of you who aren't familiar, cataracts refer to, sort of when we have cloudy areas in the lens of our eyes. It impacts vision. It's a slow, progressive type of condition. In Canada, it's the leading cause of visual impairment and the most common surgery performed in Canada. And just for context, in Ontario alone, there's about 150,000 surgeries for cataract each year. Obviously, age is one of the most important risk factors, but there's a number of others at play here as well. So glaucoma is a little bit different, but again, a huge contributor to vision loss. Many of the same shared risk factors as cataracts, a high prevalence. So again, the thinking that occupational exposure to radiation could contribute to these outcomes becomes an important public health issue. So in terms of our study population, we restricted to the National Dose Registry workers who worked in Ontario, nuclear power plant workers. One of the constraints of the data is we only have in the Institute of Clinical and Evaluative Sciences that houses all the Ontario health data, complete health data or the ability to link to outcomes from 1991 onward. So even though the National Dose Registry goes back to 1950, we kind of had to restrict our follow-up period. So we were finally able to get our data set transferred over from Health Canada to ICES in late 2022. And then we have performed some analysis largely with cohort of about 64,000 workers. And you'll see the schematic here that sort of shows how we constructed this cohort. We identified incident cataract and glaucoma through the health outcome at ISIS. We identified glaucoma because we were able to identify prescription drug use for treatment of glaucoma through the provincial billing system. Cataracts were identified from surgeries performed that were also captured in the database. So to give you a sense in terms of the health outcomes for this cohort, we had just over 3,000 workers diagnosed with cataracts and almost 5,000 with glaucoma. We were able to sort of look at the associations between occupational exposure to radiation and these outcomes through these quarterly dose estimates from the National Dose Registry. And the median cumulative dose is 7.3 millisieverts in this worker. So again, we're dealing with relatively low doses. And we looked at the relationship between these doses and outcomes by grouping cumulative exposure into 6 different categories. This is just sort of a brief overview of the study population. It's a predominantly male population, again, restricted to those who worked in nuclear power plant. And 75% of the population began the follow-up when they were less than 44 years of age. So, we have a somewhat restrictive population, again, in terms of 1991 onward. So many of these workers have not yet gone into the older ages where they identify or develop cataracts. But at any rate, some of our preliminary estimates from an external cohort comparison is we found a slightly higher increased risk of glaucoma relative to the Ontario population, and a slightly reduced risk of cataract surgery. One of the constraints is, a healthy worker effect. With the National Dose Registry, we don't have the ability to control for some of these other lifestyle risk factor differences that might persist between these two populations. But at any rate, for these reasons, we're arguing that the internal cohort comparisons become a little bit more powerful than when we take on external cohorts. So this is the findings from our external cohort comparisons. Again, grouping the cumulative exposure into 6 groups. We're not finding any evidence of an increased risk of cataracts. We have a relative risk of just over 1. It's not statistically significant. There's no presence of an exposure response relationship. And if we switch over to glaucoma outcomes, we're finding basically the same thing. So as our finding, our support of that, exposures at these very low doses are not associated with an increased risk of either glaucoma or with cataracts. And we're undertaking some additional analysis to sort of do more sophisticated exposure response fitting. But the overall take so far with our findings is that there's no association. So that sort of concludes what I had to speak about in terms of the ocular disorders. Now I'm going to pass it over to Laura, because I think she's going to talk about some of the work that she's done on the record linkage. So Laura, I'll pass it to you, and maybe just let me know when you want me to move the slide ahead.
Okay, thank you, Paul. So good morning, everyone. So I'm going to share with you the specific process that we have been conducting on assessing the occupational exposure to low-dose radiation in the national cohort of nuclear power plant workers. So please, next one. So the next one. So for this national study, we are using the linkage that, as Paul mentioned before, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission funded the linkage of the NDR cohort to mortality and cancer incidence. So that first linkage was conducted by Statistics Canada in 2019, and then the pandemic came, so we have to wait a bit to see how the linkage was, what the results were. And then the specific team that was assessing that first linkage identified that they were missing, there was an important under-ascertainment of deaths compared to previous linkage conducted by Stats Canada. And they recommend that for those missing records that were mainly for those deaths that occurred before 1970, a new record linkage should be conducted, aiming to increase the opportunity to identify workers and deaths in the early stages of the early years of the cohort. So a new relinkage was conducted by Statistics Canada last year in 2023. Next, please. And after that linkage was conducted in the first quarter of the year, and after that, team led by the CNC with Rachel, with Paul, people from Canada, and myself, we started looking at those new linkages. So for this new linkage, the data sets include not only the NDR up to 2018, but also the information of Canadian vital statistics that for this specific linkage was able to expand the time. So starting from deaths in 1926 to 2020. So the time was expanded, and also the cancer registry, and of course the tax files that were used to identify the life status of the workers. So please just go next. So we have the information. So for based on this databases, we have information of personal identifiers of the workers in the cohort in the NDR. Also, were able to Stats Canada were able to identify the if the workers were dead or they seem to be alive according to tax filing records. And the specific cause of death might be identified using the CBSD information. And the last one, of course, we have also information for cancer incidence and the type of cancer. Next one, please. So for this linkage is the 2019-2023 Statistics Canada used a kind of bit different methodology for the linkage compared to the usual linkage, probabilistic linkage that I used before for the previous working with the NDR. For this one, they are using the social data linkage environment. The Statistics Canada have been using this methodology since 2017, and it has an interrelational database, included all the information that they have for tax record, vital statistics, migration, etc. And it's compiled in a repository that is the DRD, the Derived Record Repository. So using key identifiers variables like the date of birth, the surnames, the social insurance number, sex, they were able to identify people in the NDR, workers in the NDR to the DRD, and apply specific rules. In this specific linkage in 2022, they apply new rules to try to use the initial of given names with other identifiers to try to capture like all the records in the NDR that don't have a very high quality in personal identification variables. So by using all these variables together and making this probabilistic linkage, they were able to compile a whole database of nuclear power, of general NDR workers that were identified in the DRD. So the linkage was finally processed. And some of the results of that linkage are provided in the next slide. So for this linkage, we conduct a small validation study. We look at the general distribution of key variables on the NDR cohort members that were identified in the linkage, and see how they are similar or differ from the general NDR cohort that is managed by Health Canada. Also the distribution of deaths, and identify the patterns of general deaths is what is expected for this cohort. And finally, we were able to compare the actual numbers of people identified, the actual number of deaths with previous record linkages that have been conducted by Statistics Canada before. So we're lucky we have specific reports that are available for the Stats Canada linkage that were conducted for two of the oldest sub-cohorts in the NDR, the El Dorado cohort, that is the oldest one. We have a report for 24, and for the Ontario uranium miners, we have a report on 2012. So we're able to identify if we are capturing the same number of deaths using that different methodology that used before, and we're able to identify some understatement of deaths. So next one. So there are many interesting findings in this validation study, but briefly, main results is that for this specific relinkage conducted in 2023, the Stats Canada was able to identify 92% of the total cohort that was sent for sent by Health Canada, which is a very high percentage of people that were like compile the requirements for the successful linkage. The other important piece of this validation study, could you please go to the next one, Paul, is that when comparing to the previous linkages reports, particularly for the old or the historical cohorts, we identified that this linkage was way better in terms of identifying the number of deaths, especially for those deaths occurring before 1970. But for those specific, like the older cohorts, still we have a number of individuals that were not identified, a number of deaths that were not identified. So we still have an important missing deaths from the older cohorts that might go up to 40% in specific decades of 1950s to 1961. So that means that for the further analysis, epidemiological analysis with this cohort, all researchers need to evaluate carefully the potential underrepresentation, not only for this cohort, but any subcohort that is derived from the NDR. And that's part of the work that we have started to conduct now. Please go to the next one. So the part of the work that we have, the analysis that we started now, is the analysis of external and internal cohort analysis for focus on cardiovascular mortality and life expectancy for the nuclear power plant workers. But before going down, can you go to the next one? Our first stage was to conduct a systematic review and meta-analysis of the effects of ionizing radiation, low-dose ionizing radiation on cardiovascular mortality, particularly on ischemic heart disease. And this review and meta-analysis was restricted, particularly to occupational exposure. That was the difference for previous meta-analysis that were conducted before. We are able to identify 26 studies with specific occupation cohorts, and most of the studies have moderate to high quality, but also most of them have struggles dealing with the control for confounding for external variables. The next one, please. We made comparison, we compiled the measures, and we obtained a meta summary for the standardized mortality ratios for the studies that were included, and we got a 0.81, which means that they, of course, have lower risk of having this specific cause of mortality, and it's probably related to the healthy worker effect. So it was kind of an expected result of this course, and that's why the internal comparisons for these occupational analysis are very important. So for the internal comparisons, could you please show the next one? We also can do we compile and obtain a meta summary using the excess of relative risk per severe as a measure of association. And we conduct analysis stratified by different latency periods. So we start with 5, 10, 15, and 20 years lags. And what we found was the stronger association measure was for the 15 and 20 years lag. But we have kind of fewer studies of occupational cohorts on those specific latency periods. So despite we can see kind of those response, there is not still very clear, and it's where to study those specific mortality outcomes in other occupational cohorts like the nuclear power plant workers here in Canada. Go to the next one, please. So this is the analysis plan that we have for this cohort in terms of the mortality, cardiovascular mortality. So we're starting to conduct the external analysis using similar studies, the standardized mortality ratio and internal cohort analysis to try to identify the dose response relationship. And that will be the work that we started doing, and probably I can share with you some results later on when we have that information available. So I'll pass the floor for Brianna. We're gonna talk a bit about the work that we have conducted in dementia mortality. I think you're mute, Brianna.
Can you guys hear me? Okay. So we're going to have two different studies that are going to examine dementia. And the first one will be similar to what Paul discussed using the Ontario study of ocular diseases. So we'll be using ICES data to, instead of identifying ocular diseases, we'll be using a validated algorithm to identify incident cases of dementia. There will be an external and internal cohort comparison. So the external will compare the incidence rates of dementia among the NPP workers to the general Ontario population. And then there will be an internal cohort comparison to look at different radiation exposure levels within the NPP cohort. So the second study will be what you see listed on the screen here, and that will be using the national linkage of the NDR to Canadian vital stats to assess dementia mortality. But first, just a little bit of background on dementia. So dementia is not actually a single disease, but it's rather an umbrella term that's used to describe a set of symptoms that are caused by disorders affecting the brain. An example of this would be Alzheimer's disease, which accounts for nearly 70% of dementia cases. These diseases are caused by abnormal brain changes that are severe enough to impair one's daily living and functioning. They often also impair one's behavior and feelings, and often relationships. There are over 55 million people living with dementia worldwide right now, and there's almost 10 million new cases each year. Dementia is currently the 7th leading cause of death among older people. And due to our aging population, the number of cases of dementia is expected to increase by 3 times by 2050. Could go to the next slide. So there are several possible mechanisms whereby exposure to ionizing radiation would increase the risk of dementia. And we know that radiation is an established risk factor for premature aging via the production of reactive oxygen species and oxidative stress. And we know that since radiation can alter brain cell and cognitive functioning, as well as degrade neurological integrity, it may lead to an increased risk of dementia. Go to the next slide. As Paul mentioned, a recent systematic review was conducted by some of our team that looked at the risk of dementia incidence and mortality, and they used 8 studies to generate an overall risk ratio that was 1.11 compared to the unexposed populations, and this was statistically significant. Go to the next slide. So for our study, we'll be using the national linkage, and we'll be conducting both an external and internal cohort comparison. And the external cohort comparison will compare the mortality rates among the NPP workers to the general Canadian population to create standardized mortality ratios. And then we'll also compare mortality rates of dementia within the NPP cohort based on different levels of occupational exposure. Next. So here's some preliminary results from what we've been able to run thus far. There were just under 100,000 NPP workers in the NDR that were successfully linked, and of which there were 163 deaths due to dementia with an underlying cause of dementia. However, this number increased if we included the cause of death as a contributing cause, except we only have contributing cause records past 2000. So we've excluded them for now, but we are considering adding them in and then running as a sensitivity analysis to see how those change the numbers. There were just over 2 million person years of follow-up accrued, and there was a mean cumulative exposure of almost 10 millisieverts among the cohort. Next. So we did generate some initial risk estimates, but due to the issues with the linkage that Laura previously discussed, they were severely underestimated. So we're currently considering alternate analyses to overcome these issues, with one of them being restricting to only workers who have a social insurance number. And this will be, once social insurance numbers begin, past that under ascertainment period. So it'll ensure a more valid linkage, so we're not missing so many of those deaths. A second analysis that we're considering is doing a nested case control study. And this would be comparing dementia mortality among the NPP workers to mortality from unrelated causes, such as car accidents. And there will be some challenges with this approach as well, because we'll have to carefully select the controls. But nonetheless, we're pretty confident we'll be able to produce valid risk estimates with this linkage. Paul,
okay, so
away.
Yeah, so basically, I think that's the end of the presentation. As Laura and Brianna have highlighted, we're sort of, I think we finished much of our analysis on cataracts for Ontario, and a lot of our other analysis are at a very early stage. And our hope is that the analysis will expand a fair bit over the coming years. So the other thing that I will add is that I think there will be opportunities for those in the radiation epidemiology community who want to do research with the database and are interested in postdoctoral or analyst type positions down the road. But at any rate, that's basically where we are now. And I'm happy to sort of turn things back over to you, Christy, in case people have questions.
Okay, so we'll open up the floor to questions. You can either raise your hand or type something in the chat. And if no one has an immediate question, oh, Rachel, we'll let you go first.
Rachel, you should be able to open your microphone, I think.
Oh, we can't hear you, Rachel. Sorry, or I can't.
Well, it says you're unmuted, but
No, the
okay, well,
microphone is
Rachel,
open.
yeah, you can try typing or, okay, maybe I'll start with the question while Rachel gets herself sorted. So you mentioned longevity. Have you put some thought into how factors such as shift work may be controlled for if you're going to be looking at that?
That's a good question. You know, one of the limitations of the National Dose Registry and the data captured in it is we basically have information on the workers on when they were born, their biological sex, and we have very good dose information. Now, one of the things we don't have are data related to things like shift work, if they smoke, if they drink, if they exercise, if they're obese. So I know one of the things that we've had some very preliminary discussions is to try to collect more detailed data like they're doing in Korea for one of their cohorts there, to sort of get more of this risk factor data. So then, you know, down the road, we can link that information along with the doses to better understand the role of that. So that's kind of the hope. And then other issues like how well the workers wear their badges, where they wear the badges, so we can look at things like exposure measurement error. But for life expectancy itself, Christy, I think the goal is to try to look at the risks of mortality in relation to change of dose and get those risk coefficients and then start to incorporate them into life table programs so that we can sort of assess the changes in mortality due to radiation dose alone as people age through a life cohort or a life table, and calculate the change in life expectancy that way. So that's one of the limitations. We aren't able to sort of incorporate some things like shift work. We just have to kind of assume that's the same, irregardless of radiation dose.
Thank you. Okay, we do have a question by Ashley Golden. So she says, nice presentations. Do you all intend to look at time-dependent dose response models instead of cumulative dose?
Yes, I would say so. I think, you know, one of the things that we're in the process of doing now, and you know, we've started to work with Epicure a little bit and create our person years and create a longitudinal profile, and we're starting to develop the programs where we incorporate those latencies in terms of exposures into our person year tabulations and that. So we will be looking at you know, time dependent changes in exposure as we go forward, and certainly will insist on that for Brianna in order to get through her PhD program.
I see that Rachel was hoping, Laura, that you could go back to the slide of the two linkages.
Okay. I think that's me that I'll have to find a way to sort of go back into this. Hold on.
Rachel, do you have a specific question, or do you just want some information about the percent ages?
Are people seeing me flip through the slides now or not?
No, we just see it in PowerPoint, not in presenter mode.
Oh, okay. Let me go back into sharing, share. Okay, so you should be able to see now. I'm not sure which slide Rachel is looking for. Is it past this?
No, I think after that, the table, I think, the percentage of the 2019, next one,
That one?
that one. I think it's that one, right, Rachel? It says that individuals with a linked with a definite status were those that were successfully linkage. They were 90% for the 2019 and 92.2% for the current 2023 relinkage. So that's the difference between both. And the other are individuals that were not successfully linked. The next one. I thought maybe this one. Yeah, table percentage linkage. They're all linked. They're referring to all linked people identified for those cohorts, but it's showing the number of, the percentage of deaths that seem to be under-ascertained. So they were not captured. So for the 2019 linkage, they were about 80% with the specific decades of 1950 to 1969. And for the relinkage, it decreased actually by half to 40%, but still in this specific decade, it's an important understatement of that. That's the message of that one. Yeah, it refers to percentage of deaths that were not captured from this linkage based on the previous numbers that they have on the reports of Stats Canada. So way better now, decreased by half the understatement, but it's still important in those specific decades. That's the main finding.
Okay, I don't see any more questions. I just had one more. So in your systematic review on dementia and the meta-analysis, do you have an average dose range for the included individuals? I saw that they were coming from various populations, such as the atomic bomb survivors and medical as well.
Yeah, I think in some of the, the supplementary tables or appendix table, we may have information on doses for the individual studies. One of the challenges that we had was, there was such a range of exposures. And I think, in order to generate a summary risk estimate, we were sort of, limited in that we had to create sort of an exposed versus a non-exposed group. Which is one of the challenges. Sometimes things are measured in different units slightly too. So that creates some challenges in terms of creating a standardized measure of risk across the different studies. But I think some of the details you might be looking for, Christy, are, buried in an appendix table somewhere describing the profile of the studies.
Okay, well, our group might be requesting some information because it's something of interest to us. Yeah. Thank you. I do see one more question. Was there a dose response found for cataracts?
No.
No,
and we did do like a sort of nonlinear sort of modeling like with the Poisson model and fitting a spline, I think with, three degrees of freedom. And we didn't see anything at all in terms of a dose response. And, one thing to keep in mind is that, the upper categories, we're still pretty low in terms of exposure. Like we grouped it into sextiles. So, even like the highest exposure group was like a cut point of 42 millisievert, which isn't really that high.
Yeah,
So,
not compared to medical exposures or other exposures.
No. So that's one of the limitations. But I guess in a way, if you're in that workforce and that population, at least you can be reassured that, it doesn't look like there's an association going on.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, I don't know if anybody else had any other questions. If not, I'm happy to wrap up 5 minutes early and give everybody a little break between meetings and the rest of your day. So thank you everybody for joining us today. And I hope everybody has a wonderful Friday and weekend. And thank you to Paul, Brianna, and Laura for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for joining, everyone.
Thank
Okay,
you.
have a good day.